Hey guys, welcome back. In the last video, we learned how to implement username and password based authentication using HTTP basic auth. And in this video, we will learn the concept of authorities, which is granted authority in Spring Security. Before we start, let me make it clear that whatever we learn in this video has nothing to do with HTTP basic. The only reason we are going to continue with the same project is that we have covered only HTTP basic so far. So I will reuse the project to implement the authorities. Otherwise, you can do the same thing with, let's say, JWT or OAuth. So as we go on with the demo, don't think that you have to implement HTTP basic in order to work with authorities. It's not a mandatory requirement. It can work with any other authentication mechanism. So that being said, let's get started. As the name suggests, granted authority is an authority which is granted to a particular principal. Now, principal here represents any entity which is being authenticated or which has been authenticated. So it can be a human user or maybe another machine in case of machine-to-machine communication. So it could be anything who is trying to access the system and who has been authenticated. So authority represents a permission, a privilege, or a role which has been granted to that entity. So it basically represents what the entity can do in the system. So in the absence of authority, any user which is authenticated can do anything in the system which is allowed. Almost everything is allowed. But authorities are used to put some constraints, to put some restrictions based on the role of the user. So for example, there could be a read privilege or a root privilege which represents the particular authority, which if assigned to a particular user will be able to do some kind of tasks, a predefined set of tasks which are only allowed by the authority. So that is what we mean when I say authority or granted authority in Spring Security. So here we can see there are different authorities. There could be n number of authorities in a system. It's up to us how we define different permissions or privileges in the system. Then we have the concept of role in the system. So as we will see in the demo, in Spring Security, it does not distinguish between role and authority in terms of implementation. Both of them are implemented using granted authority, which is an object provided by the Spring Security. The only difference is how we use roles and authorities and how we assign them. Authorities can be considered as a low-level permission or privilege which defines what a user can do. Then we can combine different authorities for the sake of simplicity, different privileges, different permissions under the umbrella of role. So role acts as a container for different authorities in terms of the grouping. So different authorities can be grouped and put inside a role, and then that role can be assigned to a particular entity which will define what all actions can be performed by that entity. From the assignment perspective, a role has different authorities. So you see there is one-to-many relationship or even many-to-many relationship because there could be n number of roles as well. So an authority represents a permission or a privilege, then the role represents a grouping of different permissions. Let's now talk about what we are going to do with roles and authorities, how we are going to implement roles and authorities in the demo project. So there are three entities: user, role, and authority. As we learned, authority represents the permission or the privileges in the system. So what we can do, we have defined three permissions, three privileges in the system, which is delete, read, and write. In the same way, you can define as many as you want depending on the use case and the scenario. Then we will also define two roles. The first one is admin. As you can see, admin role will have all the three authorities, which means if the user has role admin, then the user can delete, read, and write. Basically, it can perform all the operations. Whereas for the second role, which is user, this role has only two authorities, read and write, but it cannot delete the entities or the resources in the system. Okay, then we will create a couple of users. So for example, this user will have the role of admin. So basically, John Doe can do anything in the system. And then we have the remaining users, Jack and Rick, which will have the user role. That means they can only read and write but cannot delete the resources in the system. Let's move on and try to understand the flow that we are going to implement. So that's the flow we will develop in the application. There will be three endpoints, basically two controllers. One endpoint would be /admin and the other two endpoints will be read and update. Now what would happen, this endpoint will only be accessible to users which have the admin role. So when the user logs in using HTTP basic auth, because that's what we developed in the last video, so we will build this project on top of the work that we did already in the last video. So when the user logs in, the application will check if the user has admin role. If the user has admin role, then the user will be allowed and the user will be able to access the admin endpoint. In the same way, let's say when the user logs in again here in this scenario, then we will keep /read endpoint open for all the logged in users. That means for this endpoint, we will not check any authority or any role. So I just want to show you this is also possible that you do not protect an endpoint by any authority. If the user is logged in correctly, if the user has provided the correct credentials, then we can allow the users to access certain endpoints. Okay. As for the third and the last endpoint, which is update, we will check if the user has the user role and the authority right. So here we are checking two conditions, that role must be user and the authority must be right. So we will cover these use cases in this demo project and we will see how to implement them. Now, before we move on, let's understand how Spring Security deals with granted authority. So what happens in Spring Security, whether it is role or authority, is implemented by the same class or object, which is called granted authority. Okay. So granted authority represents a simple authority or even a role. Now the question is, how does it distinguish between the role and authority? The thing is, whenever we define the authority or role in the system, we basically define a fixed set of strings. So in this case, you can see these strings are admin, user, delete, read, and write. So we have a list of 5 strings. For Spring Security, these 5 strings represent basic granted authority. So at this point, it does not know anything about the role or the simple authority. For Spring Security, there are 5 granted authorities with string values like admin, user, delete, read, and write. So when we ask Spring Security to check or to apply the authority check and pass it a value, what it will do, it will simply use the simple string value to check the authority. So for example, if we ask Spring Security to check if the user has delete authority, then Spring knows there is a delete string which is available in the context, and so it will apply for the granted authority check. But when we ask Spring Security to work with the role, what it does, it uses the same authority, okay, and it considers a prefix which is role underscore. So if a granted authority has a prefix role underscore, then it will be treated as a role, otherwise as a simple authority. What I mean by that is, suppose in the system we have these 3 strings, forget about admin or user for now. So suppose in the system we have defined 3 authorities, delete, read, and write. So what that means is we can use these 3 values as simple authority, alright? But we can also reuse the same thing as role. All we need to do is, if we append role underscore delete, for example, if we prefix the delete authority with role underscore, then Spring Security will consider it as a role. And then we can use this value for the role checks as well. All right. So that's how Spring Security works with role and authority. We basically define a fixed set of strings. Then we use those strings either as authority or as role by prefixing them with role underscore. Although this can be customizable, this can be changed. I will show you the correct section of the documentation where we can see how to change this prefix. So let's talk about how we are going to change the existing project, what changes do we need and how we are going to implement. So here is the updated data model that I am going to use for this demo, because we are still using MySQL as the database where we are storing the user information. Okay. And we are using HTTP basic where the user will enter the credentials and then we will check the database for the correct username and password. So in order to support roles and authorities, we need to update the data model. We need additional tables in the MySQL database to store the roles and the authorities. So here, as you can see, we have the existing table users, which we will reuse. And then we will create 2 new tables. The first table is for authorities to store the authorities. And the second table is for roles. Although Spring Security considers them as a single object, which is granted authority, but for the data model, we will keep them separate. Authorities will be stored in the authorities table and roles will be stored in the roles table. Then you can see we will create a couple of more tables basically for the joining purpose for the association. So you can see there is another table user roles, because a user can have different roles. So in this table, we will store the user and the corresponding role. And similarly, we will have another table to hold the or to store the association of role and authorities. So in this table, we have the role ID for the role and authority ID. So that is going to be the data model for this demo. And what I will do, I will clone the old project that we developed in the last video. We will cut a new feature, and then I will also change the database because I don't want to change the existing database of the last video. Since we are building on top of the existing project which is related to HTTP basic, so we are going to use the same code base. And what I've done, I've created a new feature as you can see here, and we will push changes related to roles and authorities in this feature. Now, in order to save some time, I have done some changes already to the base project, and the main reason is because a great portion of the project has to do with Spring data code, because we need to store the roles and authorities along with the user information, that is plain Spring data JPA. And why we are doing this? Because as you know, we are managing the user store ourselves, which is the MySQL database in this case. So we need to store the roles and authorities first, before we can use them. So I will walk you through the changes that I have already done, which are required to save the data in the database. Then we will develop the Spring security part where we will use the roles and authorities together. So let me give you a walkthrough. First of all, let me show you the application.yaml where I have changed the database. So we will use a new database for this demo. As you know, we have changed the data model. We have updated the tables to store the roles and authorities as well. So we will use a new database for this demo. And in the MySQL, as you can see, this is the new database and there are no tables because we will create the tables when we start the server using DDL. Now the second step is to update the DTO. As you know from the last video, we are using these DTOs to map the incoming post request to Java objects. Now this is how the new request would look like. So along with the username, password and email, we have a new field in the request roles. And this is going to be an array. That means a user can have multiple roles. Here, as we can see, the user John Doe has a single role with name admin. And the role would have a set of authorities. So there is another field inside the role which represents a collection of authorities. And authority is going to be pretty simple. It has a single field name. So you can see the role is admin. Then this admin role has different authorities, which means read perm, write perm and delete perm in this case. So in order to map this incoming post request to the user DTO, what I have done, I have modified the existing user DTO to add a new field, which is a collection of roles. And here we are using a new DTO, which is called role DTO. So let me open up the role DTO and split it here like this. So now what will happen when we receive the post request? Okay, Spring will map the incoming request to the DTOs that we have, and this particular part, this portion of roles will be mapped to this role DTO. So as you can see, for the name field, we have a string variable name in the role DTO. Then we have added a new DTO, which is to store or to map the authority information. And in this case, authority only has a single field, which is name. So we have a simple string variable in the authority DTO. So now when we hit the post request to register a new user, we will submit a similar request like this, and the user DTO will be populated accordingly with all the relevant information. So we have added two new DTOs, role DTO, authority DTO, and we have also updated the existing user DTO. Now the third step is, once we have the data from the incoming request, we know we are also creating the JPA entities because we are storing the data in the database using Spring Data JPA. So we need to update the JPA entities as well. Now, if we go back to the diagram, we know we have the updated data model. We have three tables: users, roles, and authorities. So that means we need at least three entities, and we already have the user entity. So I will modify the user entity and then I will add two new entities for authorities and roles table. So let me show you the changes. Here we have the user entity. Okay. So this is the existing user entity. What I have done, I have added this particular part, which is to handle the incoming roles. Now in this case, as we discussed, user will not store roles directly, but there will be a join table. So we have a collection of roles, in this case set, and it has a many-to-many relationship with the role entity, which means with the role table. And there will be a new join table, user roles, where we will store the mappings of user and their corresponding roles. And you can see the same information here. We have this user underscore roles table to store the user and the role mapping. All right. So let's go to the role JPA entity, which is the new entity that I have added. This is plain Spring Data JPA. If you need any help how Spring Data JPA works, please refer this playlist where you will see all the details related to Spring Data. And that's why I have done this already, because I don't want to spend time on the Spring Data JPA code. This has nothing to do with Spring Security actually. That's why. So we have a new entity role and we are mapping this to the roles table. And then we have the required columns like primary key, the name. And because user and roles have many-to-many relationship, so we are adding the users field here as well, from the user to roles and from the role to user. Okay. Then because the role and authorities would also have a many-to-many relationship, so in the same way, we are adding a new field here, which is a collection of authority. And this again has a many-to-many relationship with the join table role_authorities, which is this one, role_authorities. All right. Then the last JPA entity in this case is going to be authority, which is mapped to the authorities table, and it has only two columns, the primary key ID and the name, because authority only has the name attribute. All right. So we have added two new JPA entities for role and authority, and we have modified the existing user entity to basically establish the many-to-many relationship with the role and the second relationship between the role and authority. So that completes the data model. And how are we going to work with these entities? For that, we need Spring Data repository. So in the same way, if you come to the user repository, this time we don't need any changes in the user repository. We have added two new repositories for the role. So this is roles repository, and we have added a custom method to find a role by name. Okay. Instead of finding the role by ID, because we need the flexibility to find a role by name. So we have also added a custom method in the roles repository. And similarly, in the authority repository, we have added the similar method to find the authority by name. We will see how and why we need this kind of method when we cover the registration part, where we will store the roles and authorities along with the user information. All right. So we have covered the DTO, the changes in the DTO and repository and to the entity. Now, when we submit the HIT request, we know there was a register method in the user service, which was basically preparing and inserting the data in the MySQL database. So we will cover some changes that I have done in the user service as well. And then we will start with the Spring Security part. So here in this user service, we had this register method where we were preparing the user entity, basically the JPA entity, and we were calling user repository.save method to save the user information. The new changes in this code will be basically to map the users as well. So this is the previous code where we were creating the user entity and setting the required fields like email, okay, username and hashed password. Now the new thing in this code will be to map the roles as well. So from the user DTO, we are getting a collection of roles because we know the user can have multiple roles. So what we are doing, we are iterating each role, okay? And for each role, first we are getting or creating the role from the database. So in case, for example, let me open up the user DTO to see the incoming request. So suppose in this case, let's go back to the user service as well. So suppose in this case, what we will do, if in the incoming request, we received the role as admin, then the first step we are doing, we are checking if this role already exists in the database. So we are getting or creating the role. Let's go to this method. And if you see, we are simply using the roles repository and it's find by name method. Okay. So we are saying, give me the role corresponding to this name, in this case, admin. If you find the name, then it means the role exists in the database. If not, then immediately create the new role in the system. So you see, we are creating a new role, setting the name, whichever we accepted in the request, in the incoming request, then immediately we are saving or storing the role information in the table. So in case if we received the role for the first time, from here, we will store the role immediately. Otherwise, we will fetch the existing role from the database. So this is the first step. Here we are resolving the role. And here we are doing the same thing with the authority. So if we check this method, what we are doing from the role DTO, we are getting all the authorities. It means these three authorities in this case. Okay. And then we are calling get or create authority. So in the same way, we are using authority repository to find the corresponding authority in the database. So if the authority is already present in the database, then we are returning that authority name. Otherwise, in the same way, we are creating a new authority in the system and storing that in the database. All right. So this is simply get or create kind of pattern that we are using here. And once we have the role and the authorities, we are setting the authorities to that particular role. So in this case, these three authorities will be linked to this role, and all these roles will be collected to a collection because the user can have multiple roles. And in the end, we are using the set roles method to set the roles for the user entity. And in the end, we are calling user repository.save method, which will basically save the whole user object in the database. So that means the basic user information and the corresponding roles and authorities and their linking. So that's the part that I have already implemented, basically to store the incoming data in the database. And once we have the data in the database, we will enhance the code basically for the Spring Security part. And I will show you how to read the authorities and roles and link it with the user information so that Spring Security can use that information. But before we start with the Spring Security part, let's add some users in the system. So I will run the service and I will try to add a couple of users that will test the existing functionality as well. So let me start the service. So the service is up, which is a good thing. That means the basic code is working fine. And if we check the database and refresh the database, we can see we have the empty tables now, which are users, roles, and authorities. And they're linking as well, which means role authorities and user roles. All right. So the next step is let's go to the Postman and try to add some users. Now, this is going to be the first user with name John Doe, the password, the email, and this is going to be an admin user. So the role is admin, and this role would have all the authorities. So let's hit the send button. And we see the user created successfully. Let's check the database. And first, let's check the users. So we have the John Doe user, you see the hashed password. And if we check the roles, we have the one new role, admin. And if we check the authorities, we have 3 new authorities in the system. And let's check the many-to-many or the join table as well. So you see this role is assigned to this user. And similarly for role and authorities, we see the roles and authorities are mapped accordingly. All right, so there is one user in the system. That means the code that we did is working fine. So let's do one more thing. Let's create one more user, but this time it's not going to be an admin user. This will be a simple user with a user role. What I mean by that is, this is what we discussed. So we are going to have 2 roles. One is admin and the second one is user role. So we already created a user John Doe, which has the admin role. We will create a new user, let's say Jack, which will have the user role. So let's do that as well. So I will change the username, will keep the password same. And this time this is going to be a user role. Okay, we'll keep the email same as well. We are not doing anything related to the user information. We just need to focus on the username and the role and authority section. Now, in case of the user role would not have the delete access. That means it can read and modify, but it should not be able to delete the resources. That is going to be the difference between the user and the admin role. So let's add the second user as well. And we have the second user created. Let's verify quickly. So from the user table, we have 2 new users, okay, Jack and John Doe. And let's go to the user roles. And here, if I check the user roles, so you see the second user is mapped to the second role. All right. And in the roles and authorities, we should see the new mapping. So you can see for the role ID 2, okay, this and this, we have corresponding authorities only 1 and 2. All right. So we have the required users in the system. Now let's see what we are going to implement using Spring Security. So here, this is the flow that we are going to use. We said we will have an admin endpoint, which will be handled by the admin controller. And this will be only allowed if the incoming user has the admin role. Okay, so that is the first functionality or the first flow that we will implement. So if we go back to the implementation here, let me stop the application. So what I've done, I have created a new admin controller, which will have the /admin endpoint. And in this controller, there is a simple method admin ops. And this is the same code that we are using. The only difference is it will have a different method that it is admin access and the user you are allowed. That's it. Now we have the admin controller, but how do we say or how do we enforce this rule that this admin endpoint should only be accessible to the users which have the admin role? So to do that, we will go to the security config, although there are a couple of ways to implement the same thing, but in this video, we will focus on the security config, how to enforce the roles and the permissions using security config. So here, if you remember the use of request matchers here, we can match a pattern of requests and then we can ask Spring Security to perform some actions. And we are going to use the same thing. So if you remember here, what we were saying that if you find an incoming request following this endpoint, okay, /API/user/register, then permit them and everything else must be authenticated. And that's why we are able to use the registration endpoint without authentication, because we are permitting this endpoint request. And in the same way, we will use the request matcher. So we will say another request matcher, and this time we will provide the admin endpoint, okay? And then we will use the methods has role, has any role. And you can see there are methods like has authority and has any authority as well. We will cover has authority in a bit, but let's focus on the has role. So here we can use the has role method to enforce the role related checks. When we use the has role method, then we pass a single role. And when we use the has any role method, then we pass a list of roles. So that means if you find any match with the provided list of roles, then based on the configuration, either allow the access or block the access. So to implement the flow that the admin endpoint must be accessible to the user only if the user has admin role, we will use the method has role. And in this case, we will pass the name of the role, which is going to be admin. All right. So now we are saying that if you find this endpoint, then permit. If you find the admin endpoint, then check if the user has the admin role. Let's go to the second one. And here we are saying that if this is the read endpoint, then it must be allowed. Do not check any role or permission. So let's go back to the implementation. And for this one, we have added a greet controller. And in this greet controller, if you see, this is the endpoint that represents basically this read part. Okay, there is a name mismatch, but it doesn't matter. The thing is, in this greet controller, if you access the API/greet point, then it will not check any role. So this is simple. If you don't provide anything explicitly here, then the access of that endpoint will be managed by Spring Security accordingly. Okay, so in order to allow all, we don't need to do anything in this case. Then there is this second endpoint, and access to this endpoint is allowed only if the user has the role user and the authority right. All right, so let's see how to do that. Now in the same greet controller, let's go to the greet controller. I have added a new /update endpoint, which means the endpoint will be /API/greet and /update. And we will enforce the rule that allow this endpoint only if the user has the right permission. Okay, so let's deal with the permission part only, and then I will enhance this code to check the user as well. So we will go to the same security config, and then we will add a new role, which is request matchers. And I will add the endpoint, which is going to be /API/greet and /update. And this, for this endpoint, we will check the authority this time, not the role, but the authority. That check if the user has the authority right permission. And we know the name of the authority in this case would be right_perm, because if we go back to the Postman, you see these are the names given to the authorities: read_perm, right_perm. All right. So we will follow the same pattern. We will give here the name of the authority, right_perm, and that's it. Now as per the updated configuration, what Spring Security will do, first of all, if it finds this endpoint, it will be permitted. If it finds the request is for /admin endpoint, then it will check if the user has admin access. And if the request is for this endpoint, then it will check if the user has this particular authority. So that's how we use the roles and authorities. We simply provide the exact name to the has role or has authority method. So let's quickly test it. So the service is up. Let's try to test the first flow, which means if we try to access the admin endpoint, then it must be allowed only if the user has admin access. So that means if we try to access the endpoint using Jack's credentials, then it must not be allowed, because Jack has the role user, not the admin. So for this one, will add a new tab, and this is going to be a GET request to the admin endpoint. And let me copy the base path like this, and we will say admin. All right. Then we also need to pass the login information using authorization. We know this already. We are using basic auth. And in this case, the credentials will be Jack and password 123. So we are hitting the /admin endpoint using Jack's credentials, and Jack does not have the admin access. So let's see what happens. And we can see we got an error forbidden. That means Jack user is not allowed to access the admin endpoint, and that's what we implemented, right? Now what happens if we try to access the update endpoint, which is this one in the grid controller, basically this one, because it is only checking the user must have the right perm, and because the Jack has the right permission, if you notice here, Jack has the right perm authority, so it must be allowed, right? So let's try to hit the update endpoint, which means /API/greet and update. But this is also forbidden. What is happening here? We know Jack has the right permission because we saved the user with user role, which has the right permission. Then why is it not allowed? Because that's what we implemented here in the security config, that allow this endpoint if the user has the right permission. Then what is happening here? Why is Jack not allowed to do so? The reason is we have some gap in the implementation. Now the thing is, we already know how this works. This method is called in the authentication flow. So when the user is authenticating itself, Spring Security will call load user by username method to basically find the user details so that it can compare the incoming data with the user information which is present in the database, which means the username and the password. So in this case also, it will call the load user by username method and it will find the corresponding user. But if you notice, in this implementation, which is coming from the last demo, we are only reading the user information. Okay, we are simply calling find by username and returning the user as an authenticated user, okay, as part of the user details implementation. But we are not returning the corresponding roles and authorities. So that means even if this Spring Security is able to find the user, it only knows the corresponding username and password. It knows nothing about the roles and authorities. Why? Because if you check, we are passing this user to this authenticated user, and from this method, which is getAuthorities, we are still returning an empty list. So that means even though the data is available in the database, Spring Security has no idea what authorities or roles this user has. So that's why this call is failing, because Spring Security does not have any information or any data on the authorities. So it cannot verify that, and it will see, okay, that the user does not have the right permission or any permission at all. So based on the security config, it will not allow this call. That's why this call is failing. So the next step is we need to modify the user service as well. We need to modify this implementation. We need to enrich the roles and the authorities as well. All right, so let's see how to do that. It's a very small change, and that is the main part of the implementation, because we not only need to store the data in the database, we also need to fetch the data in the authentication flow. Okay, so what we need to do is, once we have the user information, we will fetch the authorities and we will also fetch the roles. All right, so let's do that. How do we do that? First of all, we will have a list, because there will be a list of authorities and roles. And how we manage authorities and roles, there is a class GrantedAuthority, which represents basically the authority. Because as we discussed, Spring Security does not distinguish between a role and the authorities. For Spring Security, it is simply a string. We can use the same string value even as a role or an authority. So what I mean by that is, if we go back to the postman and this particular string, you can use this particular string as an authority or even as a role. This is allowed. So we will use the GrantedAuthority here. This is going to be a list of granted authorities, and we will name the object as authorities as well. All right. Now the second step is, from the user entity, we will get all the roles. And then, because a user can have multiple roles and each role would have multiple authorities, so in order to get the final list of authorities, what we will do, we will call the flat map like this. And for each role, we will get the authority, its authorities basically, okay? And then we will loop on the authorities as well, like this. And then for each authority, we will create an object of something called simple granted authority. And to this object, we will pass the name of the authority like this. And in the end, we will collect that list, something like this. And we don't need the unmodifiable. So I will simply change it to toList. So using this, we have the list of authorities for all the roles that this user have. That's why we are using flat map. All right. So let's put a log here. All right. So what's next? We need to fetch the roles as well, because if you notice here, we are simply reading the authorities. But how do we fetch the roles? Which is simple. So in the same list, which is authorities, because roles and authorities are same from the Spring Security perspective, they are both granted authorities. So we will do something like this, add all, and the same thing u.getRoles, because this time we only need the roles. So we will say stream.map simple granted authority r.getName collect and toList, like this. And let's add a logger here as well. Then what we will do, we will pass this authorities to this authenticated user. All right, let's go to the authenticated user and we will add a new field here, list of granted authorities, and a new field here as well, like this. And once we have the authorities, instead of returning the empty list, we will simply return the authorities in this case. So this time, if the user has the roles or the authorities, the same will be returned from the getAuthorities method. All right. So let's quickly start this service and check the values. So the service is up now, and since we are adding the authorities and the roles of that user from the database in the user service in the load user by username method, we should be able to access the corresponding endpoints. So let's try to see if we are able to make it now. So this time we will start with the admin endpoint, because admin endpoint will be accessible to any user which has the admin role. So this is the admin endpoint. And in fact, this is the URL. This is the tab that I was using. So let's change it to admin. And we need to change the user because Jack does not have the admin access. So let's go to the database and verify this is John Doe. All right. So we will change the username, password remains the same, and let's hit the send button. And we see the forbidden, although we have changed the code to read the roles and permissions. And now we are using the admin role, okay, to access the admin endpoint, but still we are getting the same error. So let's go to the terminal and see what kind of data now are we adding to the authorities. So if we check the logs here, the first log, which is for authorities, we can see that we are successfully adding the available authorities like read perm, delete perm, and write perm, which all belong to the admin role. And as to the roles available, you see, after adding the roles of that user, the final authorities list has that admin role. So if we have the admin value in the authorities list, then why are we not able to access the admin endpoint using the admin role? Well, the reason behind that is if we go to the security config, whenever we use the method has role and when we pass it a value, what Spring Security does, it basically tries to find a value in the authorities list with this pattern, role underscore name of the role. Okay, so in this case, what Spring Security will do, it will try to find if in the authorities list we have a value something like this. So if we pass the value admin, Spring Security will internally convert into a string value which is role underscore admin, and then it will try to find that value in the list. And if you notice in this list, we don't have any value which starts with the value role underscore. So we do not have any value in this list which has the prefix role underscore. So that is something we need to understand. So whenever we are using role or we are using has role method, and if we pass it a value, what Spring Security will do, it will always add the prefix role underscore. And then it will try to find that value in the list of authorities, which is not the case here. We don't have that value. That's why this check is failing. So even though we have the role admin, there is a mismatch. Spring is looking for something called role underscore admin. All right. So in the same way, let's say if we change the role to user, then what Spring Security will do, it will find the value of role underscore user. Okay. So let me revert this. Now, how do we correct it? Instead of passing it a role value, we can even pass it something called read underscore perm, which is the value of authority. Spring Security does not care about it. What it will do, if we pass it, let's say this authority, then it will try to find the value role underscore read underscore perm in the list of authorities. Okay, so we can use the same string value as a role or even as an authority. The only difference is if we are using a value as a role, then we need to add the prefix role underscore. Okay, so let me revert it back to the admin. And how do we fix it? We'll go back to the user service, and where we are actually adding the roles to the list, what I will do, I will add the prefix here, which is role underscore. And that's it. So let me restart the application. So the service is up. Let me clear the console and we will retry the same request. And this time you see the request was successful. We got the response that admin access, hi John Doe, you are allowed. Now, what if we change the user? Let's try the same URL with user Jack, which does not have the admin access. So we'll hit the send request. And you see we got the forbidden response. And if we check the logs for the user Jack, in the authorities list, we have two permissions or two authorities, which is read underscore perm and write underscore perm. And notice the role. This time we have role underscore user. But what Spring Security is looking for admin endpoint, that is role underscore admin. So there is a mismatch, and Spring can identify that this user is not authorized. The user does not have the correct role. Okay, so we got one thing right. We can now move on to test the second flow, which was to use the authority. So in the security config, we have the second flow as well, which is testing the authority, which has to be write underscore perm in this case in order to access this endpoint. So we have the service running. We can test this condition as well. We will go to the postman, and I will change the endpoint from admin to /API/create. And first we will check with the admin user. Okay, so what was the admin user? It was, I think, John underscore Doe. And if we send the request, we see that the John Doe user is allowed to update the resource. And the main reason is, if we check the service logs, let's see the list of authorities. So you can see, because this user has the admin role, so it has all the authorities, which are write underscore perm, read underscore perm, and delete underscore perm. And here is the final list with role underscore admin as well. So that means when the Spring Security will check the user login, it will find the write underscore perm in the list of authorities. So that's why the user is allowed. Now, if we try the second user, which was Jack, and notice this user does not have the admin access. And we can see user Jack is also allowed to update the resource. Let's check the logs. And as you can see, even though this user does not have the admin access, but it has the user role, which has write and read permissions. And we are simply checking the write perm, which is allowed. Now, there is one more case that I would discuss. So suppose in this case, we are simply checking the authority. We are not checking the role. So any role which has the corresponding authority in this case will be allowed. But let's say you also want to try some combinations, like the role must be so-and-so and the authority must belong to a particular role. How do we handle that? So there is one simple way to do that I will show you. So in case we have to implement something like that, even though admin and user both roles have write underscore perm, but allow this endpoint only if the corresponding authority, which is write underscore perm, belongs to the user role. So instead of passing right_perm authority directly in this case, which has no information of the corresponding role, what we can do in the user service, instead of adding the authority directly, we can also append the role name. So in this case, I would do something like this, role_getName, because we have the role details as well, and then we will append the role here like this. So instead of adding authority directly, what we are doing, we are adding the corresponding role with the authority title. Okay, so the corresponding string value will be role_the name of authority. And then what we can do, instead of just passing the right_perm in the security config, we can also pass the name of role, which in this case would be user_right_perm. So that will make sure that even though the admin user has the right permission, but if the user has the user role only in this case, then it will be allowed. So let's try this as well. All right, so the service is up. Let me clear the logs and we will go back to the postman and we will retry the same request using user Jack, because we know the user Jack has the user role. So we can see user Jack is still allowed, and if we check the server logs, we can see in the list of authorities, we now have the updated authority, which is it has the name of the role as well. Okay, and because in this case we are checking user_right_perm, it will find that value in the list of authority. That's why user Jack is allowed. But if we use the same endpoint with John Doe, which has the admin role, let's see if it happens. We can see it is forbidden. So even though admin role has the right permission, but if you notice the corresponding values for the right permission for the admin role, it has admin_right_perm. But what we are checking in the security config for this endpoint is user_right_perm. So in this case, admin is not allowed even though it has the right access. So we can use different combinations because ultimately these are string values to achieve different things, to implement different constraints. Okay, so that's all for now. That's all I wanted to share on the roles and authorities in this demo, and in the next video I will see you with a new topic on Spring Security. Thanks for watching.